Welcome to the Thought Leader Series. I'm Patricia Petty, the Associate Director of the Masters of Science Program in Positive Organization Development and Change at Case Western Reserve University's Weatherhead School of Management. Today's webinar, Sustainability and ESG, Business Opportunity or Mostly Air, will be presented by Chris Laszlo. Chris is a professor of organizational behavior at Weatherhead School, where he researches and teaches flourishing enterprise. His first book, The Sustainable Company, was published 20 years ago. Author of 4 more recent books on sustainable business, all published by Stanford University Press, he is a fellow of the International Academy of Management and past chair of the MSR division at the Academy of Management. Growing up in Switzerland, Chris became a lifelong nature enthusiast and loves to run on forest trails whenever he can. Thank you for joining us today, Chris.
Okay, I know we may have a few more people joining us, but yes, just in respect of all of you who have come on here, I'd certainly welcome any of you who want to join by with your video on. I'm hoping we can make this more conversational as well. So thanks for considering. Well, thank you, Pat. And plus have many generations on too. That's great. Brittany, hi. Hello, hello, hello. First of all, I just want to welcome each of you here and to say it's great to see many familiar and new faces. Hi, Bernard, Kristen, and Osas, welcome. One of our star PhD students in the OB department, Susan, and many more. Please do join. So this webinar is on sustainability and ESG, and it's set up in a way to recognize the growing tension between those who want organizations to be more sustainable and the forces that oppose them. So we ask, what is the business case for doing good? And how else can you help change the narrative about sustainability and ESG? I don't know if you've had this experience, any of you have had this experience, that if rational and moral arguments are insufficient to persuade some people, right, some segment of the population, then how do you engage them? How can you, as a sustainability advocate, navigate today's culture wars, if you will? Now, there will also be an opportunity for everyone to share their views and to explore these questions further. So let me share my screen. Oh, it looks, Pat, like you need to enable me to share my screen.
Absolutely. There you go.
All right, thank you. Okay, so here we go. So yes, so is all this great growing interest in sustainability and ESG, is it a business opportunity or is it mostly hot air? And I want to set up a little bit the tension, the growing tension that we see in society around these issues. So first of all, I do want to acknowledge that a lot of what I'm going to present is based on research that has been done at the Weatherhead School, research and practice. You see here over 25 years of work, which is, by the way, central to now the curriculum of the MPOD program. So in the MPOD program, you cover most of these topics: sustainability, appreciative inquiry, flourishing, women in business, diversity, equity, and inclusion, coaching with compassion, resonant leadership, and so on. All right, so let me start to set up this tension that exists. I want to talk about these last 25 years that I've had the privilege to follow very closely. As Pat Petty shared, my first book on sustainability was published in 2003, so exactly 20 years ago this year, called The Sustainable Company. And I've seen a big evolution over these 2 decades. So starting in the 1990s, when greening, it was called corporate social responsibility and greening, and it really was primarily it was primarily bolt-on and symbolic in the sense that it wasn't really it wasn't really part of the line management responsibility. It was often attached to marketing or human resource, and it was considered a bit peripheral. Then in 2011, Michael Porter, the strategist at Harvard Business School, published a paper called Shared Value with Mark Kramer, and that really made, in a much more public way, this idea that, you know what, sustainability is about creating value for shareholders, but also stakeholders, societal stakeholders, and it can go together and it can be part of business success. But unfortunately, it was really still focused on doing less harm. What I mean by that is it was around, in practice, it turned out to be about eco-efficiency. So things like, conserving energy or cutting waste or reducing materials intensity or minimizing social harm, and so on. Then there was a shift to flourishing. John Ehrenfeld, with some colleagues, I published a book in 2014 as well called Flourishing Enterprise, where it was not only about doing less harm, but it was really emphasizing incremental positive impact. So not just doing less damage, but also contributing solutions. Although flourishing at that time was primarily incremental. And then now recently, what has become all the rage in many business circles is this idea of regenerative business. How many of you have heard that? I've seen companies talk about regenerative business. By the way, feel free to put into the chat. I will try to keep track of things. There are comments in those who want to have a copy of the chat. Please let Pat know afterwards. But have you seen a growth in the move towards regenerative, net positive, restorative kind of strategies in business? So what does this trend say? First of all, the trend is one of rising expectations. So, investors, employees, the younger generation in particular, customers are expecting business to not just do minor incremental things to do less harm the way it was maybe 20, 25 years ago, or just respect the law. Businesses, to be successful, to be an attractive brand, have to be positioned as contributing to society's health and well-being. And then you see this growth of something called ESG, which, by the way, this is what the investment community calls sustainability: environmental, social, and governance. And it didn't really exist before 2004, and it took off in a very big way. So suddenly you have, as you can see here from the text, from 2011 to 2021, the S&P 500 firms reporting on ESG performance went from less than 20% to 96%. So a big growth in business, big businesses in particular, reporting on things like climate change exposure, waste and pollution, employee well-being, local community relations, DE&I, board structure, executive compensation, and so on. So that's the good news. Pat, by the way, I'm getting requests to admit folks. Like I don't know if I'm just clicking yes. This is a Gupta. Okay. Anyway, I'll keep going. So this is to say that let me just stop sharing for a moment so we can so I can say that what we're seeing on the positive side, if you will, is this rapid growth in sustainability in business and in the investment community and the interest of customers and others. And yes, Bernard Moore is asking, am I using sustainability to mean just environmental issues or that plus social and economic challenges? I'm using sustainability to be all three. Sustainable future is one in which human beings can prosper, our businesses can prosper, people can feel well, and nature is able to regenerate or rebound or be healthy. Something that David Cooperrider, Ron Fry, and I have called full spectrum flourishing. So that's the good news, okay? Big growth. Now, as is often the case, right? When you, Pat, it says I've been disabled screen sharing again. Thank you. So that's the good news. Now, what is a little more disconcerting is, as you can see here, the pushback. So as sustainable business has become more visible and as concerns in the general public have also risen, there's been a pushback against ESG investing, and over 100 anti-ESG bills have been introduced in state legislatures, blocking investors from pursuing ESG strategies, preventing ESG funds from going forward, and protecting fossil fuels and other industries. And you see here a anti-ESG map, action map by the Heartland Institute. So don't ask me why they put green to be the anti-ESG groups, right? I think it's just to confuse things further. But in Ohio in particular, we also have this Senate Bill 83, which was passed in the Senate in May, that would require, among other things, instructors to teach both sides of climate change. Now, fortunately, this is primarily, or fortunately, it will not affect Case Western as a private institution, but it is of great concern to education institutions across the state. And so I ask each of you to reflect on how does one teach both sides of climate change? And if you have great ideas, please let me know. I say that somewhat tongue-in-cheek. So part of the problem now is that the more you have this trend towards sustainability, the more you have a push away from it. So you've got climate change deniers, and I think it's interesting. Climate change in some ways is the mother issue. It's the biospheric problem that in some ways interconnects and regroups all the other social, global, and governance challenges that business has as it impacts communities and ecologies around the world. And you see here, there is no climate emergency. It's scientific nonsense. CO2 is just greening the planet. Climate change is a hoax, and so on. And so we are at a funny point now where, the question that's being asked is, what side are you on? And this is putting a lot of pressure on business executives who want to pursue sustainability and ESG, believe that it's going to be good for their careers and good for business, but are facing, not just in the general public, but as I said, in state legislatures and in board rooms, pressure that is questioning whether climate change is even real. And so I thought this would be interesting for you to consider also as a last point before we move on to the business case. The Pew Research Group put out a survey in 2022 asking, is climate change a major threat to well-being? And what you see here is from 2010 to 2022, you see the percentage of US adults who respond yes to the question, is climate change a major threat to the well-being of the nation? Now, a couple of things to observe. First of all, we only have 54% of adults who see climate change as a major threat to the well-being of the country. So that, almost half of the country doesn't see it that way for whatever reason. Secondly, it's become more partisan in the sense that in 2013, the gap between Republicans and those leaning Republican and Democrats and those leaning Democrats was only 36%. Whereas in 2022, the gap has risen to 55%. So the partisan gap is growing. It's just become more politicized or more polemic. And this is causing issues for business executives and causing issues for change agents and everywhere who are trying to work either in an activist role or simply in a professional capacity to try to contribute solutions to social and global problems. So let me turn now to what is the business case, because clearly if there is a strong business case, then business can pursue this to some extent, knowing that at least their shareholders would not turn against them, and they have to navigate the misinformation that's out there. But there's sort of a good, rational, empirical case. But then I also want us to turn to this other question about how can we change the narrative? And that question is a MPOT question, okay? It's a key question about, are there other ways besides what are called rational, empirical, scientific ways to convince people? Because we're seeing that that doesn't work very well in this country. Do you guys agree with me? Trying to persuade people with the science is insufficient. It's important, but it's insufficient. So using sort of what we've learned in OB and OD, I'm going to propose a few other ways that engage people at a more emotional and even spiritual level in wanting to pursue sustainability in the sense of business creating a not just an environmentally but also a social and economic better future. So the first thing to observe is that you have a large number of companies that already compete based on making a positive impact. You know, you've got fast-moving consumer goods from Unilever to Natura in Brazil, Dabur in India, McCormick, IKEA, and this is just a few large industry leaders in that sector that are really attempting to position themselves versus their competition as companies that are taking care of, in their supply chains, of people and planet. In the energy sector, you've got incredible stories like Ørsted, the Danish energy company that went from 100% fossil fuels to 100% clean energy and is making more money than ever and is for all of Denmark. And now they're moving into selling their services to help other countries also move towards clean renewable energy. Schneider Electric, Tesla, Adani in India. In the food domain, you've got a number of, many of you may have heard about the meat substitutes, Beyond Meat and Impossible Burger. Greystone Bakery is a great story of a social positioning using open hiring. And then in technology, you've got the big companies that are now no longer just trying to reduce their own footprint, but you know, when Andrew Medvedev and our dean went to the West Coast last year, the students met with Apple and Google and Microsoft, and those companies were now saying, you know, it's not just about reducing their own energy footprint, but it's about helping their clients to be able to reduce their footprints, their carbon footprints, and solve social and global problems. And of course, with artificial intelligence, there's a lot of hope and expectation that these companies that are pushing AI will also contribute in that area. Grab, by the way, is a very interesting case of a technology company in Southeast Asia, a little bit like Uber, but has an even broader set of. And you know, Grab is interesting because they're trying to serve what are called the base of the pyramid, low-income populations in Southeast Asia that don't have access otherwise to financing, to cars, to food, and so on. And even though they've had some financial hiccups, it's still a multi-billion-dollar company that has good financial prospects ahead of it. In fashion, there's a lot of, as you probably all know, there's a lot of pressure in the fashion industry. Fast fashion is harming the environment and social implications. So there's big efforts there to also move towards positive fashion, led by certainly companies like Patagonia. In banking, you see this. New Resource Bank is an excellent example. Amalgamated Bank, Triodos Bank, and then specialty companies. Okay, so the first thing to people who say, well, is there a business case? The first thing to note and that you can share is that, guess what? There are a lot of companies out there that already compete successfully on this. They're doing better than their peers because they're competing on the basis of making a positive impact in society and the environment. The next thing to observe is that if you look at the stock market, and if you just take one index in particular, the S&P 500, in March 2020, they created for the first time the S&P 500 ESG index, which is essentially the S&P 500 with the S&P 500 weighted according to those that are with a greater weight for those in the S&P 500 that are ESG leaders. And you see that there's a slight outperformance over time. So this is just one index. And, we all know that economics or that, these kind of one-off studies can tell any story we want. But what you see in the upper left here is an interesting meta-study that was done at the Stern School with the Rockefeller Institute that showed that 92% of 1,000 studies that looked at the relationship between ESG and corporate financial performance found a non-negative relationship. And it was framed that way because, there's been a belief until a few years ago that doing good, in other words, investing in ESG, has to cost the company something, right? It's only for those that make a lot of, that are more profitable and can afford to do this. Well, no. I think the record now shows persuasively that ESG can be a way out of bankruptcy, that it can be a way to increase the bottom line for entirely market-related reasons. And how companies are doing this, this is from my 2003 book. Companies first learn to mitigate risks, to reduce energy and waste, but then to differentiate products, to enter new markets where they can provide solutions to the ESG problems of others. By the way, sustainability in ESG turns out to be an extraordinary motivator for people, for employees, and for customers, more loyalty for customers. So it's a great way to inspire people and to build your reputation, and then to influence industry standards so that, if you can compete, but low-cost imports that that can't meet the same standards then that helps change the business context in your favor, all of which is driven by innovation. A little more technical thing, and then we'll open up again the conversation to more general things. But I think this is a really very insightful study that was done by a group of Harvard economists, Kahn, Serafim, and Yoon, in 2016, published in the Accounting Review. They looked at over 10,000 companies to try to identify the annualized alpha of the stock market returns for each of these companies based on whether they were investing high or low in materially relevant issues for sustainability or immaterial issues. Okay, it's important to understand this because up until 2015 or so, companies would do a check the list thing, 200 points for human rights, 100 points for a pollution control thing at the end of your tailpipe or whatever. So over the last many years, companies have learned to focus on what's important. So for example, in the automobile industry, materially important issue is your carbon emissions, your fuel efficiency. Whether you are sourcing paper from a sustainable forestry source in the automobile industry is less material. Would you agree? Whether you are sourcing palm oil sustainably or not is probably less important in the automobile industry. So what do we see? Well, what did the study show? More than 10,000 companies. And by the way, the annualized alphas this is the outperformance, the financial outperformance of a stock relative to a risk-adjusted index. So what you see is companies whose stock of companies that invested in immaterial and material issues. In other words, in what was important and what was not particularly important to them, had a 1.5% alpha. So they outperformed the risk-adjusted benchmark. Those that said, we don't care about sustainability at all, we're not going to invest in either materially important issues or in immaterial issues, had a 2.2% underperformance on a risk-adjusted basis. And then you've got this strange sort of odd case here where some companies were investing in what didn't matter and they didn't invest what did matter. And even here you see a very slight underperformance. But this here in the upper left is, I think, what really has now caught the eye of many executives and business leaders. And that is, if you focus on what matters in your industry, and organizations like SASB, the Sustainable Asset Standards Board, are helping businesses do that. If you focus on what's important and you don't put a lot of resources into what's not important, it can be a significant contributor to your financial bottom line. Also, the circular economy, so that instead of cradle to grave, where it's extraction, production, distribution, and then it goes back into the earth as into a landfill. These circular models where products and business models and processes are designed so that at the end of life, a product can be disassembled and materials can either go back into the manufacturing process or they can be composted with very little that actually just gets thrown out. This has been, according to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, this represents more than $1 trillion business opportunity in the years ahead. And then very few remaining things that are changing the business attractiveness, but you should really be aware of these things. One is the government legislation just in the last 2-3 years, enormous change, starting with the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, $740 billion. This is essentially the largest clean energy bill ever passed in the United States. And together with private funds, it's just opened up over $1 billion of attractive investments to not just American investors for clean energy and related type of sustainability investments, but also those overseas who might have invested in China and now see the US as more attractive because of advantageous loans, of direct federal subsidies, and other benefits. In Europe, you've got the European climate law to achieve climate neutrality, and you've also got a new, similar to the Inflation Reduction Act, let me see, I just have to look this up because it just passed yesterday. It's called the GDIP, the Green Deal Industrial Plan, which was passed earlier in 2023, which is going to do something similar in Europe to what the Inflation Reduction Act has done here. And also try to make it more attractive for businesses to move away from fossil fuels and towards net zero technologies and scale up sustainable manufacturing and distribution. And then in India, I just chose India, but there are many others as well. In India, you've got the Securities and Exchange Board of India, SEBI, which starting in 2020 has taken a major push to require Indian companies to disclose their ratings. And then just earlier this year in July, the top 150 companies in India now have an even stronger than in the US or Europe, there's a push to require them to have a third-party audit of all their disclosures. Then the ESG reporting and disclosure, if this looks a little bit like a mess to you, it should, okay? Because until a few years ago, companies that wanted to report on their environmental, social, and governance had all of these different disparate reporting options. But these have become consolidated, and they've now gone into something called the International Sustainable Standards Board, ISSB, which is now the one global comparably universal comparable standard. It's still complementary to the GRI, so the Global Reporting Initiative is still something that can be used by businesses. And TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosures, has influenced it. But the good news is that in June 2023, ISSB issued these first two universal standards, IFRS S1 and S2, which is climate specific, which now finally companies and investors and watchdogs have a set of complete and comparable standards. So when company A in Japan discloses its carbon emissions, it can be compared to company B in Chile, in Latin America. So there is a strong business case. And I should also say that part of all this new legislation here and the standards are making it more attractive for businesses to invest in ESG performance and sustainability performance. So the business case is only growing. I actually, let me stop this for a second, because let's just recognize one thing, okay? We live in a world now where in the next 10, 15 years, what do you think the biggest problems are that business is going to ask to solve for society? If you really take that very high level view, you have to see that things like climate change and social cohesion, diversity, equity, and inclusion issues are going to become the primary issue, or one of the primary issues that business will have to address in the years ahead. So, 50 or 100 years ago, the problem was 50, 100 years ago, the problem was getting material well-being, material goods to people. We still need to get material goods to a large percentage of the populations that don't have yet the standards of living that they need to have to be able to live comfortably, sort of a living wage concept. But what has become much more to the fore are issues of well-being in a general sense, well-being that comes from your health, that comes from your social context, and that comes from the environmental impacts of the world we live in. So political chaos and war, yes. I mean, I do think that political chaos and war is what's the word I'm looking for? Intimately connected to the climate issues and the social issues that we face. So it's very difficult to separate the two. If we can get our arms around solutions, and this is where business can play a big role. If business can move to taking advantage of the profitable opportunities to solve social and global problems, that can also reduce some of the political tension and contribute to peace in the world. And I point you to a lot of the excellent research that Professor David Cooperrider has done in this work, in particular on the role of business in contributing to peace. Yes, again, I'll try to address all of the questions later. But so I'm sure many of you, I hope many of you are interested in this next question, which is, how do we change the narrative? Okay, and I'm going to share with you some ideas that I'm using and that you would find in the MPOD program at the Weatherhead School. So here are 4 success factors. And just think about these in relation to any efforts you are doing. These are 4 success factors that I'm doing. In fact, I'm using these factors right now in a new book that I'm working on, The World in 2060, which is intended to be a more hopeful book at a very dark time to give people a sense of what's possible. So I'm going to make it an engaging and inspiring story that offers a compelling vision of the future, one that works for 100% of humanity and all life on Earth. But importantly, I'm going to ground it in science. I want to write it in ways that catch people at an emotional and spiritual level. But all of the science needs to be there. So when we talk about innovations in the year 2060, for example, they have to be innovations that are credible and compelling based on what we know today. A lot of this is about creating a new social imaginary. We have a social imaginary today, and it is an unhealthy one. We need to create a new social imaginary based not on the past, and especially the recent past, but some would argue the entire past of the United States. We need to create a social imaginary based on prospection, the future, what we imagine could be the world we want to live in, based on the idea that human behavior is driven by our grounded imagination, values, and intentions. And I refer you here to the clinical psychologist Martin Seligman, who really has led the effort on positive psychology. And then, again, building on the work of David Cooperrider and Ron Fry, my colleagues in the OB department, the promotion of positives, what goes right, is much more important in engaging people in lasting change than the negatives that you see on news. You know, we know what goes wrong because we're bombarded by it. But what goes wrong triggers an entire different part of the human system, the neurophysiology of the sympathetic nervous system versus the parasympathetic nervous system, and all the research that Barbara Fredrickson and others have done to show that if you promote positives and her broaden and build theory, this is what leads people to take action and to do it in enduring ways. And finally, a lot of my research since 2014 has been around practices, daily practices that lead a person, not an organization, but a person, to have a direct, intuitive experience of connectedness. And then, so these are things I'll show you in a moment, but these are things like, going for a walk in a forest, a nature immersion, or gardening, or yoga, or art and aesthetics, or having tea with your partner in life, whatever it might be. Everyone has different practices of this kind, but they are, when you have these practices, they heal you and make you whole in some sense. And then you can say, okay, well, why do we have this experience of wholeness when we have these kind of mindfulness practices? And the answer from the new sciences of today, particularly quantum science, is that the universe, in fact, is an interconnected whole. We know that at the quantum level, the world is entangled, to use the quantum term. And in fact, in 2022, we had 3 quantum scientists who won the Nobel Prize for their work on entanglement. Not the theory of it, by the way, but the applications to real-world technologies. We also need, of course, to make sure that people understand the science. This brilliant work done by the Stockholm Resilience Center that includes many Nobel Prize winners has been looking now for over a decade at what they call a safe operating space that's within this inner circle here. And in all these boundary areas like chemical pollution, which includes plastics, climate change, species extinction, land system change, freshwater change, and biochemical flows, we are now exceeding the safe boundary beyond which we risk to have irreversible harm. So this is the science, and there's a lot of very strong science behind this. By the way, stratospheric ozone depletion is now in a safe operating space because human beings acted in the 1986 Montreal Protocol, in which CFCs were banned. And so that helped heal the ozone hole. So we know we can take action. We have to be clear-minded to see that despite all the efforts to reduce carbon, you've got here, since 1958, you can see carbon dioxide emissions, CO2 emissions in the atmosphere steadily rising. And in fact, it's risen more in the second half of this period than in the first half. So it's rising faster and faster. And in 2023, it hit 425 parts per million. I would encourage you to go back and look at the historical record. We know from ice cores that for the last 3 million years, so most of the Homo sapiens and our species ancestors, it has been under 300 parts per million. And now suddenly in fact, it has always been under 300 parts per million. And it was considered, when I started in the 80s, first looking at this, I first heard of this, I remember hearing from Hansen and others that 350 parts per million was a safe upper limit to avoid runaway climate change. And to be honest with you, I cannot believe that we are here in 2023 with 425 parts per million. So how do we change? So here's one way for you to think about it. You can take an empirical, rational approach, which I call the business case for change or for sustainability. It's a little bit what I shared with you. There is a strong business case. It's based on empirical data, and it's a rational idea that if I can prove to you that A is more attractive than B, you will choose A. There's also a normative re-educative approach, which is based often on the values people have from their families or their churches, or simply the norms and beliefs in their communities. And then there's power coercive ways to change people based on regulation or on sanctioning, on enforcing laws. Now, this was first proposed in 1967 by Chin and Ben, two researchers. And we know that since then, none of these three approaches, either independently or together, have done enough to shift business to be truly an agent of world benefit. And so what our research at Weatherhead is proposing is that we add a fourth change theory, which I call direct intuitive, and it's really at the individual level, the personal level. We need to have things in our lives that give us an experience of wholeness and connectedness. So doing so changes our consciousness, which, a systems researcher by the name of Donella Meadows many years ago proposed was the highest point of leverage to change people's behaviors. So what is this change in mindset, what I call change in consciousness, so that instead of having a consciousness of separateness, which is what the Western science paradigm has given us over the last 300 years, we can move to a paradigm of connectedness. Well, a consciousness of connectedness is, and this is my colleagues at gci.earth. By the way, if you have a chance to look at that effort, gci.earth, I would welcome you to do so. But what we see is that a consciousness of connectedness is key to change. And the way we define it is it's an individual stage of being based on practices you have in your life that give you a sense of oneness, an experience of oneness with another world. And the way you make sense of that experience is understanding this new quantum view of reality that says, look, the reason we experience wholeness and connectedness is because reality is in fact whole and interconnected. At the quantum level, reality is vibrational fields of energy that connect us in space and time. And consciousness is primary. Consciousness is not something that just happens that the brain produces when it reaches a critical level of complexity. Consciousness is actually a quality of everything in the universe. Secondly, consciousness of connectedness is a collective phenomenon of seeing the whole and committing to solve social and global challenges such as climate change and social justice. So this is now moving to the group level, and it's how we see and what we are committed to in terms of the collective well-being. And that's based on a shared set of assumptions, very different from Western science, okay? That in fact, we are spirit-infused beings who are cooperative, compassionate, and caring, instead of existential, bounded human beings who are, you could say, selfish and utility maximizing and we seek only to survive. So it's a new way to think about what it means to be human. And finally, it's an aspect of leadership development, which is something we focus on, of course, at the Weatherhead School and in a program like the MPOD program. It's an aspect of leadership that integrates wisdom practices and non-dual ways of knowing to embrace oneness and pluralism. So this is presented conceptually, but a consciousness of connectedness is not conceptual. It's an experience you have from practices, in sufficient practices in your life that lead you to embody these aspects. So what are the practices? And I invite you to consider, what practices do you have in your life that heal you in a world that continues to try to divide us and that continues to give us a sense of fragmentation and of hopelessness. Is it art and aesthetics? Is it gardening? Is it exercise? Is it music? Is it journaling? Is it prayer or forms of meditation? And in fact, what is your practice? It does not have to be mindfulness meditation, sitting with your legs crossed and chanting Om. Okay, I just want to be clear. And it does include prayer. It does include religious faith. But we need to have these practices in our lives at this point in history. People who experience a greater sense of connectedness are more likely to care for others and for future generations. And so in closing, and then for discussion, I want to say that if we want to go forward with sustainability leadership in the MPOD program, at the Weatherhead School, at Case Western, and in your organizations and in America and the world, we need a strong financial business case. We need technological solutions, but we also need behavioral change. And a new consciousness of connectedness, as I'm suggesting here, is central to lasting behavioral change. Thank you. So again, I open this up for questions. By the way, in this Q&A session, I would love it if those of you who can might consider putting your videos on so we can have more of a face-to-face conversation if you're open to that. If not, for whatever reason, that's completely understandable as well. But I would, maybe those of you that put some of the questions in the chat could voice your questions here. Pat, does that work? Can we just ask people to voice?
That's fine.
Okay, great. Thank you for those of you who have been here, and please share your thoughts either in the chat or here in the group. Love to know your thoughts. That way, look, we can develop a consciousness of connectedness here in this webinar between all of us. Yeah, so what are some of the practices that you have in your life that heal you and connect you to your own life purpose, connect you to others, connect you to nature, and connect you to the transcendent? If you want to share that, I think it might be very interesting for people on this call to see what others are doing. Yes, Kim.
Hi, so I'm in a dialoguing group, and that is really a practice of connectedness. We make meaning together and can kind of sort things out from different parts of the world. Sometimes together, or we practice like Joanna Macy's Council of All Beings. Like you take on the role of our more than human world. Just little things like that kind of all come together, and just little shifts in consciousness.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Great. Thank you, Kim.
Yeah, Chris, this is Jeff. I thought you made a great point from, years ago, I remember your book about bolted on sustainability versus embedded sustainability. And I'm looking at this as a pure business standpoint, and the symbolism or the symbolic gestures that marketing departments make about, their sustainable practices. And I love the point you made at the end, and I'm going to ask, I have a question, connecting these two about the compelling vision, which I would see as a CSR. We have this vision, this is what we want to become, it's aspirational. And then you have grounded in science, which would be the ESG, using the data to establish, are we on that path, or are we creating measurable outcomes? How have you seen companies embed versus bolt on and getting away from the marketing department with the fluffy bunnies and all the unicorns and rainbows and all that, and embedding it into the measures they've taken to make this part of the employees or the stakeholders' daily, practices? Where have you seen? Do you have any examples? Have you seen companies been successful making that leap from 10 years ago to where we are today, and then generating the profitability? Because again, if you have an excellent ESG program, you're showing operational efficiency. It's just like you said, it's just natural. They go hand in hand, and you're going to be more profitable. So I'd love to hear some examples you have or seen others do, where you get away from the bolted on marketing, BS, and getting into actual practices by the employees or stakeholders.
Mm-hmm. Well, some of the examples that excite me the most are truly industry leaders. So you've got companies like Tata in India, like IKEA, and I know people don't get too shocked by what I'm going to say next, but even Doug McMillon, the CEO of Walmart, declared Walmart to be a regenerative company in the fall of 2020. And if you look at what they've done, Walmart gets a lot of negative, and I think correctly so, a lot of negative press for pushing a big box consumerism on the world that is not that has a very negative impact. But at the same time, they've exercised huge influence on their 100,000 supply chains to be able to embed sustainability from a business perspective. So Jeff, they actually the suppliers get rated not only on product quality and reliability and so on, but actually on their on the sustainability performance of the product. And it has brought a lot of money to Walmart and to suppliers. That's a separate conversation. And I've also written about this separately. So there are a lot of companies that just have seen that, look, this is just a better way to do business. But to move from the easy stuff, this is what I'm concerned about these days. That too many companies have restricted their sustainability efforts to the easy stuff, meaning that it's really just about things that they would do anyway, eco-efficiencies. Who doesn't want to conserve energy? Who doesn't want to, cut waste? But to go further than that, to actually say, look, I want to redesign my business model, or I want to change a product so that the product itself is carbon positive instead of carbon negative. That requires a deeper change, I think, in leaders. And when I say leaders, I don't mean necessarily the CEO. A leader can be anywhere in the organization. But it requires a deeper change that comes from a change in your self-identity. So I want to push you all on this, and for you to think about, what is your relationship with nature? Now, you don't have, not asking whether you like being out in nature, because I know some people have issues with allergies or with, those sort of things. But do you see yourself as your well-being is interdependent on the well-being of nature? Or do you see yourself in the Cartesian manner, this dualism of there's nature and human beings, and nature is kind of a playground or a resource for human beings? So where those changes come from in my research suggests that it doesn't come from conceptually convincing somebody. You're not going to persuade somebody who doesn't see nature as part of who we are. But what you can do is you can invite them to engage in practices that give them an experience of being part of something larger, and that their well-being is part of something larger. And so that they then start behaving differently because they are different. So you haven't convinced them just cognitively. Weatherhead is moving also more and more towards experiential field-based learning. I think that's an important thing. We're trying to engage our students in real-world experiences that have a somatic learning quality to them. That's what we need to do, in my experience. Trying to convince people to change just based on moral or rational arguments is unlikely to do the trick. But good questions. So yeah, I think we are seeing more. It's not so much the tech giants who are doing it, although they're developing platforms. And by the way, guess what? Artificial intelligence is now being used to not only write ESG disclosure reports, but also to assess them. So we're moving into a new world here. But it's really primarily these international bodies like the ISSB and the IFSR that are going to be monitoring this. And I think it's good. I don't think it should be left up to individual businesses, high-tech companies to do. So, Pat, we are at the top of the hour. I don't know if there are some closing comments you want to make, or
Sure. And if anybody wants to hang on for a few minutes after this session, Chris has agreed to stay with you and answer further questions you might have. But with respect to everyone's time, we'll close the session today formally. And I want to thank all of you on behalf of Chris and I for taking the time to join us. I also want to give my sincerest thanks to Chris for providing this informative and inspirational presentation. I also want to invite everybody back next time. We will have our next Thought Leader series on December 6th, when our MPOT alum Cheryl Duvall and panelists Jessica Pearson and Gensler Raleigh will present the importance of discovery, innovative strategies that deepen understanding. So I hope to see all of you online again next month. And Chris, you can stay on as long as you would like to answer further questions.
happy to do so. And thank you, Pat, for helping organize this.